Welcome to AfricaCom TV at the 20th anniversary of AfricaCom, already a record-breaking AfricaCom with more than 15,000 people coming to do business. And one of those people who's here to do business is Paul from Huawei. Have you had a wonderful time?
Look, I think, do I have a wonderful time? I'm a little bit under the weather, but let me tell you, it's my first trip to Cape Town. I've been coming to South Africa many times and to a lot of different parts of Africa and the world. And I must say that Cape Town, you put on fabulous weather for us. So how could it not be, possible to like the place? 15,000 people. I'd love to say that that's because of my, but certainly it's the event, the hosts, all the sponsors. Wonderful event.
It's early days, but what have been some of your highlights so far?
Look, we just kicked off, I think you mentioned just before I came in that yesterday we had a product launch, so the P10 and the Mate 10 products from Huawei. So, if you're plugging, it's obviously it's a device that we promote. But perhaps more importantly is the connection. Why do we have events like this? It's terribly important. And I don't think of Africa region. I think of Africa really as the growth engine for the world over the next 20, 30, 50 years, to be quite frank. And if we don't hold events like this, then it's not going to be possible for Africa's voice to be heard.
Yeah.
And so why do I, what do I get out of it? That's probably the first thing that I noticed was from the panel discussion, the comment that came that, Africa is terribly local, regionally, but terribly local. And that needs to be promoted, I think, to the rest of the world. You have a lot of great things here and it needs to be exported.
Not too long ago, you were presenting the Visions for Africa keynote presentation on the digital society fueling new growth for Africa during the next decades. For those who were not in the auditorium, what were some of the highlights?
So I only mentioned three key components, and the first one was really to look at the trends. So what are the trends, the behavioral characteristics of people? And Huawei coined a phrase about 4 years ago. We call it ROADS. Real-time, online, anywhere, do-it-yourself, social. This is a behavioural characteristic that's been created largely since 2007 because of the iPhone and the platforms and LTE and all of these things coming together. The second one is really to show that Africa, the population, will be increasing over the next 8 to 10 years by about 25 or 30%, largely urban, largely youth-driven. But a large portion of Africa is still unconnected. Either they don't have a mobile phone, 57%, or they're not on the internet, for example, 3/4 of the people, or they have no broadband at all. So they're opportunities that we need to solve. I say opportunities we need to solve because we can't make an opportunity without fixing some of the intrinsic problems. And so that's really what I was then doing. That was the first scene setting. The second component was to try and tell the audience or give the audience 6 case studies, practical examples of companies, MTN, SAT, Safaricom, Vodacom in Africa who are making certain successes. And then to summarize by giving 3 simple steps on how we should be able to do these things from connection to digitalization to monetization. And I know everybody thinks that when vendors come to these programs that we're here to sell. My job is to make market space. Huawei has become a leader over the last few years. And as a leader, with a leader comes responsibilities. So what's the responsibility of a company like Huawei at events like this or globally? First of all, it is to give, I think, knowledge so that we can all be better informed to make the right decisions so that you don't invest inappropriately. How can Africa, we need education programs, we need health programs, we need job creation. How do we do those things? There are good examples from all around the world. And so we encourage this type of information and knowledge sharing. In terms of sales and money, that will come later. Yeah. But first we have to develop markets together.
You've been in this game for 30 years. What have been some of the, I suppose, evolutions in the business, in Africa particularly, that have left you wonderfully surprised?
All right, so I can remember being here in Africa in the mid-90s, in fact, many times. In fact, I'm probably one of the few people who've ever been to Somalia. And I was proud to say that there's a large Somalian population in Melbourne, in Australia, where I come from. I actually come from Sydney, but the population in Melbourne is quite significant. And I recall back in the mid-90s, a few Somalis came to me and said, "Mr. Paul, we were told you know how." And I said, "How to do what?" And he said, "We have no infrastructure in Somalia. How about you be our partner and be the telecom?" So I raised funds, we built the network, and subsequently sold. We called it OzSoma many years ago. I did similar things over in Madagascar. I did the same thing Nigeria, which subsequently became MTN after we sold the license through. So I've seen a lot of changes, from the days when there was no mobile to today when, just take example in Nigeria, you have more than 100 million subscribers. Despite some of the statistics I mentioned, a large portion of Africa is connected. A lot of rural programs have been created, a lot of very innovative programs, particularly things like M-Pesa through AfricaCom in Kenya and also Vodacom in Tanzania. More than 30% of the GDP of the country has been developed through the power of communications. So you asked the question earlier about this thing called digital society and digitally enabling. It's really about individuals understanding how to use these technologies through connectivity and providing different type of educational benefits, but then for them flourishing and developing new businesses, which ultimately translate into a better GDP for the country and a better life for the people.
Which speaks to a very key component of Huawei, doesn't it? Where you need to go into Africa and actually realize the socio-economic difference for the people of Africa.
You're very right. Do you know Huawei actually started our business outside China in a couple of key areas? One was in Russia, which was some basic reselling, and the other one was in some of the northern parts of Africa, Algeria and in the Middle East. Okay? And the reason we did that is because it was terribly difficult and nobody else would come here. But also, we saw the opportunity. So we tried to do things. Mr. Ren, the founder, Ren Zhengfei, he had a vision, a different type of way of doing it. Let's not try and compete with the people who are stronger and better than us. Let us apply our capabilities to those who need us. And let us learn together. And then let us develop the right skills together, the right products together. We had a lot of, so we learned a lot. We learned a lot from Africa. We learned a lot by doing business in some of the most difficult markets. And we're proud to say that we still invest in Africa as opposed to perhaps others who have not been. So we know the margin is less. We know it's more difficult. We understand it's very challenging. But Huawei does this. We had to do it in rural China. We've been doing it in sub-Saharan Northern Africa since 20, 25 years now.
What future developments are in store?
Look, the world is changing very, very quickly. The power of computing and devices, miniaturization and things like this, it's developing, as you know, virtual reality, artificial intelligence and all of these things. So where is the world heading towards? The world could go on to 12 billion. The world could implode at 9 billion. There are a lot of discussions going on between such learned people as Stephen Hawking and others about the dangers of things like artificial intelligence without having the right sort of standards and infrastructure that allow these types of discussions to be used for humanity as opposed to by those who perhaps see a different version. And I think Huawei's participation in this coming from a very strong R&D background. We have 185,000 people, more than 80,000 of them are R&D. We spend more than $15 billion US in R&D. We're the highest contributor. So we use this to do a couple of things. One is intrinsic, I would call it intrinsic R&D, so intrinsic intellectual property, those things that really matter. 4G standards, 5G standards, optics. Then we moved into other areas such as graphene, into batteries, battery management, I'll say, in terms of lithium oxide. We moved into artificial intelligence to try and take what we have learned to try and put them into these algorithms. We've diversified from fixed network, wireless network, core network, software, into other areas like AI. We now understand the reason it's so important to collaborate. It's terribly important. The new direction of business is through collaboration. It's through ecosystem development. And that's why Huawei now faces some interesting challenges. Becoming the leader, you have obligations. So how do we lead the industry? And it's not just the telecom, it's because all the industries are becoming more blurred. And therefore, we have a more difficult job, I would say, from a company that grew up from China with largely technical Chinese experts to now a company that still has an average age of about 35, can you imagine, but now covers 170 countries globally and makes about $90 billion. How do we now change? The board of Huawei, what we call the EMT, the executive management team, is always challenging everybody in Huawei to try things in different ways, unique ways, new ways, and trying to share components rather than we take all the profit ourselves, because we've realized if we share it with you, you're probably more likely to be a partner. And I think that's really the direction of how the world is changing. It's becoming more partner ecosystem based as opposed to a few companies dominating.